The other way, the thing that characterizes this future warfare being fought today is the ever present threat, not just of reconnaissance drones, but of FPV drones, right? Of to vehicles. They're very easily targeted. There's such heavy presence of drones on both sides of this of FPV drones. They've come to dominate the conflict, not entirely, but to a significant degree. Word is now that some 75 to 80% of Russian casualties now are the results of FPV drones, whereas previously, in the beginning, first year or two of the conflict, that was due to artillery shells. Artillery shells are a much smaller part. If you want to talk about how many casualties are actually a result of um, encounter battles with the enemy that you can see with small arms fire, right? Guns, that's less than 5% of the casualties of this conflict. And that actually is fairly consistent. So you can see that it's very difficult, I think, for people who even me with a military background and knowing full well what's going on, it's hard to put myself into the reality of the conflict. You have to watch a lot of videos, a lot of first person, to really get a sense of it. And even then, that unless you're there, it's hard to fully understand it. But when they're doing mapping now, they've actually added an expansion. Most mappers, first there is the Kiev regime controlled territory, right? That's pretty clear. There is the Russian controlled territory. That's pretty clear. And then, of course, there's the gray zones, right? The areas that is actively being contested on. There's fog of war, and it's not clear who has a higher degree of control of the area. Well, now there's a new area classification on the maps, and that's called kill zones. And these are areas where the drone presence on both sides is so heavy. There's such a concentration of drones in that area that no infantry units, no mechanized forces can enter that with any relative chance of survival. That's why they call it a kill zone. And the only way to deal with those is either to flank them quite timely, time intensive, out to other sides and try to cut off supply lines, depending on the size of it, or finding and neutralizing, drone headquarters, which are often mobile, right? Not always, but often mobile with long range strikes, to reduce the amount of drone coverage. For there have at various parts of the larger Pokrovsk area battle that has been going on for several months now, we have seen repeated kill zones, rise up, be countered, and then start to degrade away, and then new ones will pop up elsewhere. And when you have such a kill zone, it's difficult for either side to move in. So to deal with this FPV drone threat, vehicles have become not very useful because when you have a couple $100 or a couple $1,000 kamikaze drone that can either destroy or at the very least immobilize, enabling it then to be destroyed. Very expensive tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and the like, and such that they don't really provide any degree of physical protection for troops in that way. For a quite an amount of time, for most of the summer, Russia severely decreased the amount of armored vehicles it was using along the contact line. And what they have turned to instead is what is sometimes it's being referred to as either infiltration tactics, or I've heard it also described as trickle tactics. Right. So advances are done into the enemy territory, held territory, with small infantry groups, right? Sometimes as small as 2 or 3 people. And the idea is that they make it easier to avoid drone detection and or action by FPV drones, right? That may see one or two or whatever people, and it's not worth the invested time. So what they do is they head up to the Kiev regime's defensive lines, and because the Kiev regime doesn't have enough manpower to fully man this whole contact line that Russia has purposefully stretched out and is pressuring all along that line, there's now plenty of spaces where there's no one or very few people. So Russian forces, instead of building up trying to mass up a critical mass on their side of defensive line, which would be detected and then hit with long-range strikes, right? That's been the problem all along for offense. They're sending troops through 2 and 3 and so forth at a time that basically sneak through, and then they form a critical mass on the far side of the Kiev regime's defensive lines, behind their defensive lines, which usually results, of course, in the very quick collapse of those defensive lines. And they've been very effective with it, in relative terms. Now, it has to be said, this isn't entirely new. The Kiev regime already tried this, although this isn't being remembered much in the Western mainstream media. In that ill-fated NATO planned armed trained general defensive in 2022, in the summer of 2022 in the South, summer of 2023 in the South, they first tried this U.S. style maneuver warfare, which essentially means an armored tank blitz, right, at the defensive lines in big armored pushes to penetrate the defensive line, usually with demining vehicles in front to remove the minefield. That's the idea, and then infantry, only bringing up the rear. This is, what it's maneuver warfare. This kind of what the U.S. regards as this magic Jedi art of maneuver warfare that only they can understand. Well, there's a lot of problems with that. They were running onto minefields. They were facing absolutely overwhelming artillery incoming as they were moving. The Kiev regime not only didn't have air superiority, as U.S. armed forces engaging in such maneuver warfare always do, but the opponent had air superiority over the contact line. Russian forces did. And that resulted in this maneuver warfare, big tank and armored vehicles pushes, just being sighted and destroyed for the most part before they ever reached the contact line. But what they switched then to was this idea of trickle warfare, where in order to avoid what was then primary, not drone, but that was primary then artillery strikes, still early then on the conflict, drone use was just starting to become strong. They sent 2 and 3 people forward, right, all along. However, the Russian defensive lines were too well manned and too solid, and they did slightly better than with the NATO maneuver warfare, but they still never really got past the first defensive line. Right. But Russia utilizing that tactic now, the Kiev regime just doesn't have the manpower to man their defensive lines. So it's a much more effective tactic. And it has done wonders. Now, it has to be said, in the last really just week or 10 days, Russia started to turn up the use of armored vehicles again. But I think that's only because essentially the defenses in Pokrovsk and Kupiansk have already essentially, collapsed at this point. It's really just cleaning up operations, and they're able to temporarily take advantage of operational space in those greater areas, and so the vehicles are more useful and less susceptible to concentrated FPV coverage. So this is Russia's having success moving up in the south as well, in Zaporozhye and Dnepropetrovsk. And at the same time, early next year, as Russia is taking that last defensive line in the Donbass, they absolutely will not stop pressing forward in Zaporozhye and Dnepropetrovsk region as well. I think it's entirely possible that they could also attempt a crossing of the Dnieper River in the south, to retake Kherson city. That is something that may already be beginning. Of course, that could be an attempt to divert forces. We don't know, but it's entirely possible sometime within the next year. And I think that's going to be important. Russia is going to want to take Kherson City and Zaporozhye. That will become their next priority after the Donbass, because they have already claimed those territories as injected them into Russia's constitution as part of Russia. So at the very least, they want to do that, before any considerations of everything else. But they don't want to have to storm those cities by force, to take them with front-on assaults, right? They don't want to turn them into another Mariupol, or something like that. So they will, for the most part, try to strangle them, right? To cut off supply lines and force the Kiev regime forces to withdraw, or, to quickly decompress in those areas under extensive pressure. And again, if you see the maps of the cities that Russia's moving forward on, you can see it as well. A year plus ago in Avdiivka looks almost exactly like what is happening now on Pokrovsk, where Russian forces are just completely surrounding that whole urban area on, it's really more than three sides. It's not a complete encirclement. It's more like around 80%. But that remaining 20%, all of the supply lines left in that area are also under very intensive drone and artillery operational control as well, meaning the Kiev regime it can't effectively get forces in and out, supplies, reinforcements, wounded, though forth. They're strangling the big urban areas. So two different tactics in effect. One, for defensive lines, for all along the contacted line in general, this infiltration tactics with small units, penetrating through, forming a critical mass on the other side, and then just kind of collapsing that whole area. And then in big urban areas, big flanking maneuvers that take the urban areas into almost complete encirclements, cauldrons, almost, right? Again, the goal is to cut off the supply lines, and those are tactics that are working. They're not quick tactics, right? They're not the enemy collapses 2 weeks, but they are sure, and they minimize casualties on the Russian side and maximize casualties on the other side, which has been the goal of the war of attrition all along. Don't believe anything you hear about Russian casualties in the Western mainstream media, which is just cribbed straight from the propaganda of the Kiev regime, which is about as realistic as their claims that since the beginning of the conflict that Russia is running out of missiles and tanks and rations and everything else they've claimed, or all of this nonsense that they've said about this conflict all along. The most egregious bit of propaganda is almost the reversal of the actual casualty numbers that are occurring on the conflict line, and that's basically to keep political support behind the conflict, because if they knew how bad the casualty ratio was in Russia's favor, then it would become clear how pointless continuing this to fund and arm this conflict is, and how really detrimental to Ukraine as a state, as a people, as a future demographic it is entirely. So that's where pressure all along the contact line, several big urban areas right now on the brink. In the Donbass and in the southern Kharkov area. And Donbass will be essentially mopped up in the first half of next year. And then it will be a moment, and it will be turning to the Kiev regime and to its Western masters and saying, are you done yet? Should we stop? Right? Are you ready to accept our terms? And if not, as they said, they'll keep going. But then the terms will get that much harder because it won't be 5 regions, it will be 8 or 10, right? And then there may, as the Belarusian president pointed out again this week, this is not the first time it's been said. He's not the only one who said it. The same thing has been said by Medvedev and Lavrov and others, right? The West and the regime in Kiev, they have a decision to make because soon they'll have to, if Russia is forced to continue, if they don't accept reality on the battlefield, right, and make terms, meaning agreeing to Russian terms, then the future existence of an independent Ukrainian state may stop. It may cease. Ukraine may cease to exist as an independent state, and they're perfectly serious about that. And I think, unfortunately, while that's not what the Kremlin wants, right? That is, they're being pushed, so that's the only opportunity. That's the only option they have because the other side won't stop, and that's the only way to make it stop. That is almost certainly where this conflict is going to end, which means it won't be over anytime soon. It will be a long, hard, bloody slog to that end, but that's where it will end.